can you briefly describe the major conclusions of the report about the Ukrainian reforms which were made in Chatham House?
The basic conclusion of this report is that the forces driving reform at the moment in Ukraine are marginally stronger than those obstructing them. And what we've tried to do is to explain in a broad context the challenges facing Ukraine, the processes that are underway in the country, and to look in particular at the internal factors and the external factors that create this really very complicated situation that for Western audiences is rather hard to understand. So this is a broad look at the issues, and we hope the paper will be useful in informing discussion at policy level about where Ukraine is headed, because inevitably there is going to be a reassessment of Western policy towards Ukraine after 2 years of really very intense effort to support the reform process here.
When you look at Ukrainian reforms, where do you find positive sides and where do you find failures?
Well, I think a very obvious sign is that the country managed to resist very substantial Russian pressure in 2014. The macroeconomic situation has been stabilized. There are encouraging things happening in a whole series of spheres. The police reform is, of course, taken as the most graphic example of a quick win. But we now have civil service reform underway. We've seen some really, I think, substantial efforts to make the issue of state procurement, for example, more transparent. There are important things happening at the national gas company, Naftogaz. So it's not as though nothing has been happening, but often the impression is created that because so little has happened on the really difficult issue, for example, on judicial reform or what we call anti-corruption, that therefore nothing is happening. And of course Ukraine has very severe challenges in this area, and it has to address them. And Ukraine's key international partners here have pushed very, very hard to try to make that happen. But one of the conclusions that we draw is that Ukraine is not Poland, it is not Slovakia, and it is not possibly even the Balkan countries, which struggled with these very issues themselves over a long period. So Western countries need to keep up the pressure. At the same time, they have to have realistic expectations.
Can we talk about Ukraine fatigue, this disappointment about this pace of reforms, which is slower than it was expected in the West?
There are definitely signs of some Ukraine fatigue at the moment, and I think it has to be said that a number of Western countries have put a great deal of effort into supporting the reform process here. What they worry about is that Ukrainians have become dependent on this level of effort, and this focus is just not sustainable in its current form. So both sides have to be aware of that. We will continue, I believe, for the moment to support the reform effort very vigorously because we do see progress has been made, and talking to a broad range of people in different embassies and foreign ministries, the impression is they see that yes, there has been change, not as much as they would like to have seen, but it's certainly enough to justify further support. But we have to look at not just what's happened over the last 2 years and is going to happen over the next two years, but over possibly the next 10 years. How sustainable is that focus from outside? That is going to be a big question.
When you're asked, for example, why the West should continue its engagement with Ukraine, what would you respond?
Well, I think the question can be answered at a number of levels, but firstly and most critically, Western countries have no desire to see any sort of disorder in Ukraine that could spill over into Europe. They see that the situation here is absolutely essential for Europe's wider security. Secondly, they see that Ukraine is at a very critical stage of its development, that it can't, given what it's experienced over the last 25 years and the revolution took place in 2014, we cannot expect to see immediate dramatic results. But if we get it right in terms of our policy support, and if Ukrainians can acquire the self-belief, if you like, that change here is really possible, positive change, then that opens up enormously positive prospects. Not only would Ukraine stabilize itself with much less effort. There would be economic benefits, of course, for everybody, particularly Ukrainians. But I think the knock-on effect for Russia and the wider, if I can call it, former Soviet space would be absolutely enormous. And the effect on Russia itself of these changes that are now being attempted here in Ukraine, I think are going to be very profound. So there is the huge opportunity. If we were to walk away from this and say, we don't think it's possible, then that we would create for ourselves a long-term lose-lose outcome.
When you talk, when you say that current focus, current level of attention of Western countries to Ukraine is not sustainable, do you think it's gonna weaken in the coming years if the pace of reforms is the same? And what can be the reasons for this weakening?
Well, I think you have to consider the fact that Western countries, and particularly European countries, are facing a huge number of problems, both within their own societies, elsewhere, externally. We have the possibility that my country, the United Kingdom, might choose on June the 23rd to leave the European Union, which is going to have enormous consequences, not just for Britain, but if it were to happen, but also for the European Union. It would weaken Europe in a significant sense. We've got a migration crisis. The euro crisis is far from resolved. We've got this division within Europe between north and south, the southern countries being opposed to the harsh austerity measures. So keeping a focus on the external front in these conditions is actually very difficult. And there is inevitably going to be a feeling that we've put so much effort into Ukraine, but less effort, let's say, into the Middle East or into other problems on our neighborhood. We now need to divert some resources. That is just inevitable, I think, regardless of how things develop here. But the hope, of course, is that the change here will acquire greater momentum, and that we will not be required to be on sort of crisis management duty from day to day. Now, on the positive front, I would say the fact that we've got this far and that Ukraine still has this opportunity to deepen the reform process is in itself a big achievement. And that's not just our achievement, it's largely the achievement of Ukrainians. So we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves, yet on the other hand, we need to be clear that if Ukraine doesn't continue to make progress, then the situation could get very much worse, and that's going to have broader consequences for us all.